We've reached Raywat Deonandan to talk a little bit more about all of this. He's associate professor and epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa. And of course, if you listen to this show, you're going to recognize his voice. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. Now, I'm wondering, I'm thinking back to Robin's conversation with Dr. Vera Etches last week, where she said the numbers are going to rise. Is this the level that we should have been expecting, or should we be chomping on our fingernails, or a bit of both? What do you think?
It's not the level I was expecting. Mm-hmm. I was expecting a slower and less sustained rise. And remember, no rise is good. Yes. So the goal here should be to have a decline, not a rise, especially as the school season approaches. And our goal should be to keep the caseload in the community as low as possible, such that we can open schools safely. So anything that goes up is cause for concern.
And how much concern?
Well, at this point, I think there's a fair amount of concern. I mean, the reproduction number, that's the average number of cases that an old case produces, is kind of similar now to what it was earlier in the pandemic during the explosive growth phase. And that's not to say that we're there right now, but if this rate of increase is sustained for the next little while, then we're back to what looks like the climb towards a second wave. I don't want to actually say that outright, but I just did. So it can be serious if not curtailed.
And in terms of what we know about where these cases are happening, right? We do know that this seems to be linked to stage 2 activities, not bars or restaurants reopening, but rather indoor gathering or outdoor gatherings, I should say, but where people aren't respecting social bubbles. What exactly do you think is at the heart of this problem?
I think there's a problem with messaging and an understanding of risk. So I'm fond of quoting both Uncle Ben from Spider-Man and Viktor Frankl, two of my most important philosophers in the world. Viktor Frankl says something about, rights are irrelevant unless they're in the context of responsibilities. And of course, Uncle Ben said, with great power comes great responsibility. And here the power is in freedom. And if you live in a liberal democracy, you can probably understand that, freedom is a kind of power. So the freedom we have now is, with stage 3, is to go to bars and things like that. With stage 2, the freedom was to socialize to some extent again. And people have to understand that that means you have the power to move the needle of this disease in another direction if that freedom is overexpressed. And that bit of nuance has been lost in large extent in the messaging, I think. People see that now, things are looser, so therefore the disease is less serious. And to an extent that's true. The burden in the community is lesser, but the disease is not serious. It's still out there, and it can reassert itself spontaneously and aggressively at any moment. And I don't want to foment panic. We don't want that. At the same time, we've done sort of the opposite. We've fomented blaseness, lackadaisicalness.
Complacency.
And
perhaps,
it's that sweet zone we have to establish between
somewhere between complacency and panic. Yes. I do wonder when we look at how the Premier addressed this yesterday. I mean, you talk about nuance or lack thereof. He was very straightforward about it. He said, just don't go to a party. Simple. You are hurting people by doing this. I don't understand why people want to go to parties. Is that a helpful response?
Right. So now we're into the science of public health communication, which is, more an art than a science. And we have to deploy all of our tools, both the carrot and the stick. That's the stick, or that's one aspect of the stick. The real stick is criminal penalty. So scolding has a role to play, but also encouragement. So there's some people who are going to respond by being reminded that they have the opportunity to be heroic, to be mindful, and to be respectful of other people's health. That can actually be inspiring to a lot of people. Other people need a reminder that, you're being a bad person and you might hurt others. Others still need the force of law to compel them into action. So just sticking to one message may not be sufficient, especially in a diverse population like we have, where we have to target different demographics, different age groups, different mindsets. And unfortunately, we have not invested sufficiently in public health messaging. I don't blame anyone for that. It's just societal oversight. And we're learning so much from this pandemic, including how to speak to people in the era of rapid information flow, something that, of course, you in the media are experts in.
We try our best. You say we haven't invested sufficiently in that communication, but there's also the question of the communication itself. And we've heard you on the news this morning talking about the possibility that some of this messaging around bubbles versus gathering is getting a bit muddled. What is the clear message that public health authorities should be giving?
Well, around the bubbling, the clear messages, there are a handful of people you should be confident in interacting with intimately and regularly, meaning people that you're going to touch and kiss and hug and not wear a mask around. Beyond that, be wary of everybody else. Avoid everybody else if you can. And that's unfortunately an anti-commerce message to some extent. You know, the places like restaurants and nightclubs that shouldn't be open anyway are anathema to that kind of thinking. But that's what's missing here. Now, there's a difference between a bubble and a social gathering. The bubble is the people, again, that you have selected for the rest of the duration of this emergency, who you will be intimate with. And the social gathering is the people that will change on a regular basis depending upon the context of your day. And that distinction has not been well communicated. I don't know that it can be well communicated. Mm-hmm. It might be too complicated of a message for people to really digest well. Maybe we should simplify it by simply saying, avoid people. Because the disease doesn't just appear spontaneously. That seems so sad,
though. I mean, I appreciate we're in a very sad situation, but a message to just completely avoid each other when the mental burden of this pandemic certainly is playing a role, and I think particularly for young people whose, you know, in some ways their social circle becomes a sort of surrogate family for them. Do you think that is the point that we're at?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. If I were, I'm an old man with no social life, so it doesn't affect me that much. But, you know, if I were a young person going on dates and things like that, I'd be very concerned. So when I say avoid people, it doesn't mean, you know, avoid social contact. Luckily, we have the electronic infrastructure that allows us to have a social life virtually. But beyond that, you can still go on walks. You can still go on hikes and play distance sports like tennis. You can still sit in a patio as long as you maintain your distance and wear a mask. You can have social contact, just don't do so irresponsibly. And it's a slippery slope, right? So as soon as you're in a joyous event, and maybe alcohol is flowing, there's a temptation to slip down that path towards a little more irresponsible behavior because you allowed yourself to forget that there's an emergency afloat. You know, we have these gatherings to make us forget, to sort of get that semblance of normalcy again. And so there's a bit of a contradiction there. I'm telling you to remember there's an emergency. At the same time, I'm telling you to behave as if there isn't one. To engage in those activities that pull you out of that moment. So we're in an unprecedented psychological state as a society. We've never had to sort of navigate this sort of conflict at a mass scale before. And it's interesting to see what tools are being most effective. Canadians in general are being quite responsive to this sort of crisis. Mm-hmm. A handful of individuals are not. And I don't want to be that scolding old man again, but it seems that we have to sort of focus on those handful of individuals who are driving the explosion in cases. And as we've discussed, it's a certain age demographic, and I understand why. I totally get why they're doing it. But what message resonates with that group? I think increasingly the message of responsibility can resonate if it's expressed in just the right way.
We just have less than a minute left, but I wonder, is the stage 3 reopening at stake?
I think it is. And the reason I think it is as I'm fond of saying all the time, is our goal right now should be do everything possible to be able to open schools safely in the fall, because everything hinges on that. A thriving economy hinges on the ability to send our children somewhere. So if we cannot get this right now, we may have to scale it back to drive the case numbers down again so that we can reopen schools, that is.
Well, listen, thank you very much for giving us your perspective on this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Raywat Deonandan is an associate professor and epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa.